I'll start by some. And the very first one is that, ma'am, right now I'm pursuing undergraduation in aerospace engineering. Am I allowed to enter medicine in masters?
So I don't know about the system for you, but in the UK, if you're doing an undergraduate degree, you can move into medicine really at any point. Some just so I did an undergraduate degree in physics and medical physics. It's quite unusual to join medicine as a graduate because often people know that they want to do medicine from the beginning, but I didn't. So I did 3 years undergraduate, and then in the UK you can join a medical course, and that will be 4 or 5 years. Some courses are 4 because they assume that because you've done a degree before, you can kind of speed it up, but others you kind of have to start back at zero, unfortunately. So it wouldn't really be a master's as such because you'd still have to do the full 4 or 5 years of medicine.
All right. So the next is by a doctor. That as a physiologist, I want to know the exact cardiovascular changes in the human body because the knowledge or the research articles available are conflicting. And as you said, the sample sizes available are very small. So what are the particular exact cardiovascular changes?
Yeah, so the main one that I think everyone agrees on to start with that one is that the baroreflex is blunted. So that's kind of the reflex that reacts to changes in your blood pressure as such. So with that blunted, it means that because of that increased fluid, all your vessels are going to be dilated. So they're getting used to a new set point of your vessels being more dilated than they are down on Earth. And then that's when you also start sort of secreting fluid through the ADH pathways and that kind of thing, through your kidneys, and getting rid of that excess fluid because your body thinks that you've just got too much fluid and it doesn't realize that it's just a shift in microgravity. The heart changes are the ones where there's quite a bit of disagreement, as you say. There's 2 main schools of thought. The first is that your heart is a muscle, and just like the muscles in the rest of your body, it starts to atrophy, so you start to lose muscle mass in your heart. And they've done scans before and after flight and all that kind of thing to try and prove it. But the issue is, the other school of thought is just saying that because of that fluid shift, when you first go up to space, that fluid shifting up into your upper body, and it's kind of also imbibing your heart muscle, and your heart muscle is becoming bigger because of the fluid, not because of excess sort of muscle mass as such. And that when you leave space, when they're doing the scans after space and finding that your heart is smaller, they're saying that's just because the fluid has been offloaded, because you're not in microgravity anymore and you haven't got that shift. So those are the 2 main schools of thought. I personally haven't done research in that particular area, so I can't really tell you which one is right, which one is wrong. I think there's a bit of both, but it's definitely somewhere we need to do a lot more research and do research that's looking into both of them rather than just sort of getting set on one pathway as some of them have.
All right. So the next one we have here is a really unique one. So it's she's asking, what is the current status of menstrual hygiene on board the ISS, International Space Station? Till now, most women astronauts prefer suppressing their menstrual cycles until they return back on Earth, but that won't be a good option when it comes to long-term flights. So what can be a probable alternative to that?
So that is even further from my own field of research. So I wouldn't really be telling you anything that you can't find online. I think the leading expert in sort of women's health issues in space is called Varsha Jain, and she's based in the UK. So I'd have a look at some of her research, her papers, because she has sort of looked into that for a long time, and I haven't myself kept up with that. So I wouldn't be able to give you a full-on answer, but you're right, they so far have decided on suppressing their menstrual cycles, and in the long term I think this probably won't be an option, but it's something you have to weigh up as well, with having to bring menstrual products up to space, and that will use up some of that weight requirement that I mentioned. So it's really a trade-off, and it will also be a completely personal decision. And we'll have to give the astronauts that kind of sort of space to decide what they want to do. But I would definitely look up Dr. Jane's work, because that's not my field of work, sorry.
Right. So we have another undergraduate student asking that he's a student of microbiology, and is there any chance for her to contribute in the field of space study?
Yes, absolutely. I think anyone can contribute, even in sort of fields that you wouldn't imagine, but microbiology definitely. So a lot of the experiments that we do with ISIT, the International Space School Education Trust, are microbiology based, just because those are the easiest to send up. So we sent up E. coli agar plates and Staph aureus agar plates, and we tested their response to different antibiotics. And it was a very basic experiment, but it's some of the easiest that you can do. And there's a lot of microbiology work going on and some really interesting innovations. So I think there's definitely a whole field out there for you. And I think medicine and the interplay with medicine is also a very interesting one, because essentially that's what we want to do, isn't it? We want to keep the astronauts safe. And there's a lot of work on pharmaceutical development in space as well.
Right. Next is similar question. A medical student, he wants to know if he can become an astronaut. So would that be possible, and what pathway could lead it to becoming him an astronaut?
Yeah, definitely. I think as astronauts, if you're a doctor as well, that's definitely something that's going to prove that you have a whole field of study, but you also have the kind of years of experience that it takes to become a doctor. So as a medical student, so I'm not applying for the ESA applications either, just because I'm currently still studying, so I don't meet their minimum requirements. But as a medical student that will then become a doctor, I think definitely be an asset to the space agencies. But also, as space tourism is coming, then you could just apply to work for Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin as their physician or their working doctor, and then you might get to go on some of their flights and monitor some of their clients who need a little bit more medical monitoring than perhaps the average space tourist.
Right. Now, remaining longer in space is going to affect the genes of the astronaut or their genotype. Is that possible?
So again, very specific questions, which are great, but obviously not something that I've recently done my own research on. So for that, I would have a look at the twin study that they did with Scott Kelly and his brother. They did find some genetic changes. So they found, very strangely, that the telomeres at the end of his chromosomes seem to get longer, even though you'd expect them to get shorter with time passing. So compared to his twin brother, and they definitely found a few genetic changes that are very, very interesting. But it's all published, and that's the main genetics in space study, I would say. And then if you just have a look a little further, there are some smaller scale sort of non-human as such experiments going, but definitely an interesting field of study.
So there is another question related to the medicine, especially that supposingly if someone has a disease or needs to take a medicine in space, so is it something different than we take here on Earth? Is it specially designed or something, or is it the same? And how does that affect the body in the lack of gravity?
So at the moment, obviously, most of the people we're sending up are astronauts that are very healthy, so they don't have to take medication regularly or anything. And the space tourists that we did send up, those 7 space tourists, didn't have any ongoing medical conditions that needed treatment when they went up. But I think the interplay of drugs with the body will be different in space, and it's definitely also another area that scientists are looking into, if you need to maintain a patient up in space, for example. But that will mainly be because of the fluid shift. We don't know how drugs will be different in terms of their absorption. You also know that we excrete a lot of fluids as we go up to try and get rid of that fluid shift. So will drugs be more or less effective, and will the dosage have to change, is a big question in that area.
So there is another, just a follow-up question to the previous one, that the earlier participant has gone through a few of Varsha Jain's papers. She wants to ask, does the research on that field come under space medicine?
Yes, definitely. It's definitely an area of space medicine that probably needs more research. Unfortunately, because we have less female astronauts than male astronauts, I think there's only 10% of astronauts ever have been female. It's definitely an area that's expanding now that our astronaut classes are becoming a lot more balanced. And it's definitely an area of space medicine. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in it to get the word out and start talking about it so that more research is done, because it's an important area of something that hasn't been looked at until now, because we didn't really used to have female astronauts at the beginning of the space program. So I think it's a very exciting time for that field, definitely.
Right. And then the next one is that she wants to do an internship, online 1 month internship in space medicine. So what are the criteria of it, and from where should I do it?
That's not really something I know all the answers to. I would
I
say
think you answered for the SGAC's behalf on
yeah.
how to enroll in that program, or the other institutes
Yeah,
also.
I think having a look at the different organizations and their websites, I don't, off the top of my head, know of anything that's going. I think the European Space Agency has an internship going. I don't know if it's 1 month or if it's longer than that. But having a look at all their web pages and their job postings is the best way that I can suggest for that. There's none that I know off the top of my head. A lot of the space medicine work, at least that I'm doing, is really in my own time, sort of extra work that I'm putting in, that's not sort of paid for or anything, just because I enjoy it and I'm passionate about it. And if you want to work full time at that, then you're having to probably at the moment apply to space agencies internships, but you can also have a look later on maybe at SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, and they're starting to post a bit more.
Right. We'll take the final question here. And he wants to ask, is there any scope for computation playing a role in space medicine, maybe for diagnosis or automating the process of providing medical support in space? If yes, can you refer some sources to know more about it?
I can imagine it's a yes. I don't know any sources directly. I think that there are a few sort of robotic surgery machines that have been developed for space and then been used down on Earth as well. Particularly even just the technology for the robot arm that's used on the ISS, which isn't a medical tool at all, was then translated back down to Earth to a surgical robot. I think it's going to be a big part of the future of space computation, definitely. I think the only thing about controlling something in space from Earth will be that time delay. So in terms of the medical side of things, you're not going to want to be doing surgery with a robot that can only respond 20 minutes later, just in case the patient starts bleeding out or that kind of thing. But definitely in support of missions, they'll be there. There's a lot of work in VR as well, I think, that the astronauts are using, even just to go for a run and pretend that they're running through a forest for the psychological side of things, using VR rather than just running on a treadmill in front of a wall on the ISS. I think, yeah, computation is definitely a big one there. Things are growing, but I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly the specifics of it. As you've seen from my presentation, my background is really in the general space medicine, and then I'm doing projects on intracranial pressure and space surgery, but I wouldn't be able to tell you the specifics of computation as such.
Okay, that was great. And I see here a lot of other questions as well, but I know we have a time limit to how we can pursue this webinar further. I'm sure if you are passionate enough, the participants can reach out to Eleanor anytime at her social handles, and she'll see if she can answer those.
Yeah, I'll just put my email in the chat.
Of course. Right. So there we go. Thank you very much, Eleanor, for coming in, for accepting the invitation. And that was really great. As I mentioned before, this is really more of a guidance kind of a thing, with the perspective that I see, to explore the opportunities that lie in front of us, but we are still blinded. So thanks to open up our eyes, and we'll see you soon in some another webinar.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'll conclude the session here. Thank you all for joining this webinar, and I'll be ending this session here.